Okay, so this is a briefing for CLFN members on caribou. My name is Finn, and I work in the Lands and Resources Department, and this is one of the files that I handle here for the department. So I've been working on this caribou file for about a year, and as of December of December of 2017, we finally saw the government's caribou range plan. Today I'm hoping to take CLFN members through that range plan. We're going to talk about the implications for Cold Lake First Nation and also look at the next steps that the department is doing, making sure that everybody has an opportunity to be involved. During this sort of briefing, we're going to have questions open on the sidebar of this. If people have questions, please don't be afraid to ask them, and we'll try to go through them at the end and make sure that they get answered in a way that people are happy with. We'll try to make sure that we get people as much information during this session as possible, but I don't guarantee we can answer every question. This briefing is going to focus on the facts of the situation and the proposed upcoming things that the department is going to do. There are some things that are still strategy, and we're looking for input from the community on what exactly we should do. So that said, I'll jump into this PowerPoint that I've prepared here just to try to keep myself on track. So the Species at Risk Act is a piece of federal legislation that is, I forget the right one there? Yeah, so the Species at Risk Act is a piece of federal legislation that's actually quite powerful. Once a species gets listed under the Act, that means that people are required, governments are required to take action to protect it. Under the Species at Risk Act, it has happened in Canada, in Alberta actually, that the federal government has had environmental groups pursue an order in court requiring them to revoke the jurisdiction of the Alberta government to issue more approvals. That happened down in southern Alberta in a sage grouse case that Eco-Justice brought in, I believe, 2012. So what's required of the Alberta government is to produce what's called a range plan. The range plan is this document that outlines how the government of Alberta intends to meet the obligations it has under the Species at Risk Act. In the case of caribou, this means that they need to show that they're going to have a viable, self-sustaining population of caribou into the future. And caribou are a unique species in that they react really poorly to disturbance, especially linear disturbance like roads and seismic lines, pipelines, well pads, all that stuff. Caribou stay away from it. And so as a result of this, Environment Canada has put a very large buffer on it, and it's 500 meters. So Alberta has to show how they're going to get to 65% of the caribou habitat being more than 500 meters away from a linear feature. That is a major change in the way that Alberta regulates oil and gas development and development in general. So it should come as no surprise that this is a very complex and controversial topic. So on to the next slide here. So let's talk about Cold Lake First Nation and caribou. So the Cold Lake herd range is in the CLAR. In fact, about 65% of the Cold Lake herd range is inside the Cold Lake air weapons range. This map shows that the range stops at the border of Saskatchewan. That's because Environment Canada divides these ranges up just because provincial laws vary between jurisdictions. So everybody understands that caribou migrate across that provincial border, and that caribou have been around long before there was a border there. So you're going to see that the way that this shakes out is that actually across the border in Saskatchewan there isn't really any disturbance. So remember I said that linear disturbance was one of the big problems. So over in Saskatchewan there's no oil development, and so there really is very limited disturbance. So almost everything we're going to talk about here is about Alberta, primarily for that reason. So everybody understands that CLFN have historically used, caribou. They've hunted caribou. They track caribou. Caribou are tied to culture, and the loss of caribou is bad. It not only is it an ecological indicator, but it's a culturally valuable species for CLFN. And because of, as I mentioned, the issues around development, cumulative effects, other things that our department has been talking about for a very long time. CLFN has a big interest in the outcome of this process, and so we're following it very closely. So I want to talk for a second here about the population of caribou. So the population of caribou has been declining for some time now. Since records have been tracked, you know, you can see on this graph that the population has been below 1. So this is what we call in biology fecundity. So 1 is the population is stable, so it's neither increasing or decreasing. A number above 1 means that the population is growing. A number below 1 means that the population is shrinking. And so what this graph shows is that since basically 1999, populations have been shrinking, and that's bad. So they're not staying stable, they're actually falling every year. And so they're declining because primary cause, approximate cause, as they say, is wolf mortality. So especially calves, when they're born in areas where wolves have a lot of access in, and they're able to come after the caribou, and they do, and they get a lot of caribou. And so, as a lot of people will tell you up on the Clar, there are a lot of wolves around, you know, probably more than there used to be. And so the wolves use the seismic lines, the roads, the pipelines as highways to get into these areas. Caribou's life strategy is they hide, they run away, and they go to areas where the wolves can't get them. But once you open up all these seismic lines, you freeze down all these ice roads, the wolves can get in there, and they do. And that's the proximate cause of the mortality. So development, disturbance, wolf mortality are closely tied together. And the other issue is fire. So caribou need old growth forest. That's their habitat. That's their favorite place to be at. And we've suppressed fire for a long period of time, meaning that we've changed the fire dynamics on the landscape. So fire is an important driver of what good habitat is and isn't for caribou. So we have to think about that in the future. And the government of Alberta's range plans need to also take into account disturbance by fire. And that, of course, is a difficult thing to figure out. And one of the tasks that Alberta has in front of them is to actually define where the critical habitat that they're trying to protect is. It can't just be sort of over there or everywhere. And fire is a big component of that. And it isn't well understood where fire will burn next. I mean, we can talk about risk, and we know how severe fires might be, but we don't necessarily know where exactly they'll burn next. So now I want to talk a little bit about disturbance in the herd range. So this is a map that shows the Cold Lake herd range. And so if you remember, I know it's kind of hard, this one doesn't have the air weapons range on it, but you know, the little blob down in the far south there kind of corresponds with the south boundary of the air weapons range. Well, as you can see, a lot of this is disturbed, so 87%. Now remember, the target Alberta has to achieve is 45% disturbed. That's what they have to get to, and they're currently 87. So something like 50% of what you see on that screen needs to disappear, and needs to disappear in the not too distant future. So that's what range planning and caribou recovery means. Some of the areas inside the air weapons range are the least disturbed. So that's important if you're CLFN. You have a lot of interest in the air weapons range, and because of the restrictions and the activities in there over the years, that's actually some of the best habitat that's still available for caribou. So we can be happy about that. But as of course everyone at CLFN is already aware, D&D can be difficult to work with. It can be a challenge, and the same forces that keep everybody out of the weapons range also restrict the opportunities to do wildlife management in the range. And that's a challenge that isn't going to go away anytime soon. So what causes disturbance in the range? Well, 35% of the Cold Lake caribou range is disturbed by forestry, 63% by oil sands, 56% by petroleum and natural gas leases. And so you can see those numbers don't add up to 100. That's because this disturbance actually overlaps each other. So in a lot of places out there on the landscape, you might have all three types of disturbance on the land at once. So what we see right now is that actually disturbance on the landscape is increasing. Since 2011, it's gone up 15%. So it's not getting better out there, it's getting worse. So total undisturbed habitat has fallen to 9%. So you know, the situation on the range is complicated by the fact that there's a lot of development going on there, but it's also complicated by the fact that the problem is actually getting worse, not better. Okay, so now what? I'm going to try and talk about what the government is proposing in this Caribou Range Plan that's been released as of December of 2017. And so CLFN still hasn't provided formal comment on it. The range plan proposes that basically we're going to work on both angles of the problem. So as I talked about, one problem is the mortality, so wolves and caribou, and the other problem is the habitat. So solving one problem without solving the other problem is not going to work in the long term. You have to try to solve them both. So restoration is a really important part of it. And as I mentioned, the amount of restoration on the landscape is actually very large. It's sort of a huge problem. How do you erase this linear footprint? And then also, over time, we need to think into the future here. How do we then plan for the future footprint? So unless the province is willing to buy out oil and gas leases, then they're going to still be obligated to allow more disturbance in the range. So oil and gas companies and forestry companies and gravel companies and everybody who's working out there on the landscape, they actually need to provide some plans about what they're going to do in the future. So what will happen in the Northeast Range, or the Northeast area, which covers pretty much Fort McMurray, Cold Lake, in Northeast Alberta, there will be a provincial multi-stakeholder committee and 3 regional committees. The Northeast region covers Cold Lake. So there'll be a multi-stakeholder committee that works out how this reclamation work is going to be done. And a third party would then implement that work. So this third party is likely going to be a contractor, although there are other options. There could be cooperatives developed. It really is impossible to say at this point what the future of that looks like. But what's in the range plan is that they have a strong preference for local First Nation contractors. So there's an opportunity there from an ECDEV perspective. However, the methods by which you do reclamation are really, nobody has ever done this. This is not something that there's a large body of literature on how exactly you do it. And so this multi-stakeholder group is also going to provide input for an offset program. So offset programs are basically, if you disturb one unit of habitat in one place, you have to reclaim an equal or greater amount of habitat elsewhere. So that is something that can be used to shift reclamation effort around on the landscape. So it's not clear how this is going to be applied to CLFN territory. And it really is unclear what's going to happen with respect to lands on the air weapons range and lands off the air weapons range, because there are access restrictions, there are timing restrictions, and, you know, to be perfectly honest with you, there's some level of potentially joint federal provincial responsibility there on the weapons range that doesn't exist off it. So active linear features, so here we're talking about pipelines and transmission lines that are still in use today. And so the plan as proposed requires that pipeline corridors be revegetated to a maximum width of 4 meters. So many of you out there have been on some of the larger transmission corridors up in the air weapons range. You'll know that the Enbridge mainline corridor is like 120 meters wide. Imagine shrinking that down to 4 meters. That's a lot of work. You know, that's about 100 clicks long, and, you know, a huge amount of tree planting that would have to go on in there. Transmission lines, so power lines in caribou habitat will be revegetated to a maximum width of 2 meters. So that pretty much is just the area underneath the line would be allowed to be kept open. So that's what's being talked about here. All these features are going to have to be blocked from human access if they're in caribou range. So that means, just like it sounds, there would have to be like blockades put up where pipelines cross roads, or, you know, seismic lines cross roads. And that's the requirements that are being talked about. And so next up is this concept of appended development. And so appended development is a new term that basically means shrinking all that footprint on the land down into as small a package as possible. So you can see on in this slide here I have up, so top left corner, 9% undisturbed habitat. That's basically what we have now, where there's pipelines, there's roads, there's well pads, there's seismic lines, and they're just all over helter-skelter on the landscape. And As we start removing some of these things, so in the next slide to the right there, you see seismic and pipeline restoration. We get that done, we're up to 17%. If we get redundant roads off the landscape, we might get to 20%. And we get to this appended development concept, which is ideally at the 65% undisturbed habitat. That is something that can only be done by changing the way that development practices work. So requiring more lateral drilling, more long offsets, those types of things, and erasing the existing footprint that's out there. So that really is a long-term planning thing. And I mean, most people who have been around the patch understand that this is not how oil companies work. I mean, they don't do 20-year planning. They do 2 to 5 year planning on capital expenditures, and their plan is always bigger in the future than it is now. So this represents really a fundamental change in how energy is going to be sort of developed and extracted. And again, we're not really sure what this would look like in CLFN territory, primarily because in the air weapons range, D&D has effectively forced this type of planning already. So there really aren't a lot of redundant roads up there. I mean, there's a lot of seismic lines and pipelines that can be revegetated, but we don't have the kinds of problems that you'll see if you ever go drive around in the foothills. You'll see roads owned by 6 different companies and forestry cut blocks and, you know, pipelines all over the place. And so this really is something that to think about how development would work down in the area around Imperial, over to Wolf Lake, and then potentially on the north side of the Clar, up by Winifred Lake there. Those are the areas where you have these multiple overlapping jurisdictions. So access management, as I mentioned, we're talking about blocking off existing management or existing access and really having a better plan into the future about what access is going to be needed over time in order to access the resources. And so the critical thing here is what's called a regional access management plan. Companies, all of them, are going to be required to develop and submit regional access management plans to the provincial government. The provincial government is then going to try to squish them all together and come up with an approved access network that balances the need to give companies access to the resources with the need to protect caribou habitat. And so the principle at this point is that if we can reduce the access amount, we can maintain access to the resource, or I should say the province can maintain access to the resource while lowering the density of these features on the land. So this, of course, has implications for Cold Lake First Nation. Everybody understands that First Nations use those access routes for the practice of treaty rights, and we all need to better understand which access routes need to be kept open to which places. This particular piece is going to be contentious, and CLFN is going to need to do some work to make sure that people's ability to access resources is retained over time. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the landscape management piece. And there's more to this. This is a 212-page management plan that the province has been proposed. But I want to shift now and talk about caribou and wolves and alternate prey. So caribou, like I said, are sensitive. They get run down by wolves when there's a lot of linear features. And everybody understands that the linear features that are on the landscape are going to take a long time to come off. Even if we start doing reclamation today, it's thought that it's going to be about 30 or 40 years to actually get viable caribou habitat in some of these areas. So in the interim, we need to keep the population from going extinct, basically. And that requires a level of basically hands-on invasive management into the landscape that has never really been done in Alberta. And if anybody is thinking that this isn't a big deal, after you hear this stuff, I think you're going to disagree. So what we're talking about here in the caribou population management side is the fencing project, or a fencing project. And there are 2 basic types of it. There's a temporary maternal pen. There are some of these operating already in British Columbia, and there's a permanent fencing project. So a permanent project would be basically what's up on the screen, where you take a large area, probably about 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. You remove the bears, you remove the moose and the deer and the other animals that would compete with caribou for food, and you put caribou in there. Maybe about 40 females and about 5 or 6 males is sort of the ideas that get tossed around. And when they have yearlings, you let them out and they rejoin the herd and hopefully join the population and become breeding wild caribou. That's one approach. The other approach is a temporary maternal pen. And so this is a little bit different in that it is not a permanent facility. You put it up every year, maybe you keep it up for a year or two, but you take pregnant females into this facility. You have to tranquilize them, net gun them from a helicopter, transport them into this facility where they get up, they give birth, and they stay in there until about, I don't know, mid-May, June, something like that, at which point you let them out. And so by now, the calves are strong enough and large enough that they can get away from the caribou, or from the wolves. So those are sort of the two approaches. And the reason that this stuff is being trialed out in BC is that it's been shown just suppressing the wolf population will stop the decline. So if you remember the graph that I showed you earlier where one was stable population, so just suppressing wolf population by shooting them from helicopters, which a lot of people disagree with, by the way, so just that step alone only gets you to 1, a population growth rate of 1, which means it's stable. So what we want to see if we're managing the caribou is we want to see a positive population growth rate. So 1.1, 1.2, something like that would be great. So you have to do something like this, it's thought, in order to recover the population. You can stop the decline by controlling predators, but you can't grow the population. There's no decision yet on whether or not this will be done or could be done or by whom in the Cold Lake herd range or in Alberta in general. But it is thought by people who think about it that at least 1 or 2 of these facilities is likely to be tried. Now, I mentioned that they're operating already in BC. There's a project called the Cleansay-Za project, which is run by a consortium of the West Moberly and Salto First Nations, Dene bands in Northeast BC. You can look up this this project online and have a read through their news reports. We're going to try to get some of their people who work on this project to come over here in about March and talk to the community about what the experience is there. The other project is down by Revelstoke. That project is also run by the First Nation. So what I'm trying to convey to the community here is that caribou management has only ever been done by First Nations. And so if it is going to be done in Alberta, it is quite probable that it will be done by First Nations, not by industry or the provincial government. So earlier I mentioned the fact that you probably need to do some type of fencing project to deal with the mortality issue. And so in the short term, and this is happening right now, is wolf cull is going on. So they are shooting wolves from helicopters on the Clar, off the Clar, in these caribou ranges. And the Alberta Trappers Association has a wolf bounty program up. You guys can go and look at that. It covers the range. Of course, CLFN is the registered trapper in the Clar, so wolves trapped in the Clar are eligible for this bounty. I don't personally know the details of it. I haven't had a chance to read them, but I know that program exists. In the future, say the 5 to 10 to 15 year time span, it's probable that shooting wolves is not a very good way of keeping the populations down. The other way you can do it is you can lower the population of what are called alternate prey. So wolves, like all carnivores on the landscape, their population will grow based on the size of the food supply. So we can try to reduce the number of wolves, but if we don't also reduce the food supply, then the wolf population will rebound. And so the other management tool that we could use here is to suppress the population of deer and beaver and whatever else the wolves feed on. So unfortunately, especially in the Clar, we don't have really good estimates of the population or the carrying capacity, and it really is unclear how this will work in the long term, although I think a lot of people would agree that there's a pretty clear role for First Nations in this process. So what is the department doing? So like I said, we've been working on this issue for a while. The stuff is just sort of beginning to look like it's going to be solidified, and there's solid opportunities for input. So we have basically 2 TK studies that are coming up here this next week, actually. where we're going to corral some people, get a bunch of people into a room, and we're going to ask some questions of elders and land users, and we're going to ask basically, where have caribou moved historically? And so this is really important because not a lot is known about caribou movement on the land. People didn't really start collaring caribou until relatively late, maybe the mid-90s, and they only collared female caribou. So there's no information on male caribou, and there's no information about what happened prior to, say, 1995. And that's why, in my opinion, it's probable that traditional knowledge here can really add something to the discussion about habitat and recovery and range, because there are a lot of people out there who know a lot more about how caribou behaved before we started to collar and tag them. So what habitat is important? This is also pretty critical because caribou habitat changes over time based on the forest. So the caribou are around for a long time. The forest has changed a lot over time because primarily in the past it was because of fires coming through, and you'd have newer forest and older forest and this kind of patchwork out there on the land. So we want to better understand what types of habitat are important, where do people see caribou out on the land. And then, as I mentioned, there's probably going to be this predator alternate prey management strategy. And so how can CLFN contribute? How can we be involved in that management plan? That's quite a complicated question, especially when it comes to the air weapons range. Obviously, CLFN has a unique position with respect to Department of National Defense. We have ongoing discussions and open lines of communication with them. So we think that there's an opportunity here to develop some land-based activities that contribute directly to management of the caribou and of the alternate prey. So upcoming engagement, there's going to be a meeting with the provincial range planners. They're coming out at some point. Stay tuned for some details there. They're going to probably give a presentation covering quite a bit of what I just talked about. We're also going to bring in some of the experts in this field. So we're talking about, leading academic people are very interested in coming out and talking to the community, not just to our department, about caribou management and what the science and what the best practices are. As I mentioned, we're going to try to bring some people from Clentezat out to, again, talk to the community, talk to our department, talk to leadership about how their project has worked over in Northeast BC. We're hopefully going to do some more Facebook Live events, assuming this one is successful. We think that this is an interesting way. We're going to try to engage more with people this way. I have a couple of movies that we're going to show here at some point, and yeah, so we have some stuff coming up. We're also really open to any other ideas people have about how to better engage with the community about on caribou. So the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of what the department is doing is that Cold Lake First Nation has signed on to a petition with a group called EcoJustice and the David Suzuki Foundation to petition the federal courts for what's called a Section 61 protection order. So I mentioned that off the top. The protection order would effectively revoke Alberta's jurisdiction to issue new developments in the range on the basis that caribou habitat needs to be protected. So until critical caribou habitat reaches 65% is the theory. So CLF has signed on to this petition. The petition is in federal court, and April 1st is the date when the federal minister is scheduled to make a decision about whether or not the laws of Alberta sufficiently protect caribou habitat in Alberta. And that is a very complicated question. I mean, I can't stress this enough that there are a lot of trade-offs that are going to get made on the landscape out there in the not too distant future, in the next 3 months, and it's worth considering what CLFN can contribute to the process and how we make sure that the nation stays involved at the right levels. So this is a big part of why we want to do some more engagement, is to get some more input from the community on what we should be doing. So that's all the slides that I had prepped. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Ed, did we get any questions there? No, so so we don't have any more questions yet. I guess I can share a little bit more about what the plan is with the TK study. We're going to be doing interviews next week. We compile a list of people based on past TLU work. So the department has a big database of TLU information, including quite a few caribou, observations of caribou scat, tracks, and then historical knowledge about areas that were important travel corridors. So obviously some of those people are elders and have passed on. Quite a few of them have not. So we're going to re-interview everybody who has provided information in the past on caribou. And we've also identified quite a few land users that we hope to bring in to be a part to gain a better knowledge, gain better understanding of what their ideas are around not only caribou and their movement and their habitat, but also their the alternate prey issues. So beavers, how long in particular in the CLAR, we want to better understand how much access to the weapons range would be needed to actually action some of these things. And so in order to do that, we need to have a better understanding from the community what's required. So we had a question there about the legal action. So I actually don't know the details there. So the petition, I believe, was filed at federal court in Calgary. The judge, I do not believe, has set a hearing date. It is probable that nothing will happen with that case before April 1st, but again, I'm not a lawyer, and I'll have to get back to the community with more details about what the plan is there, because we are signed on supporting this, but this is an action that's being brought by Eco-Justice. So yeah, we're not necessarily following it as closely as probably we should be. Any other questions? So the predator alternate prey thing is really where, in the future, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for engagement with the nation. Over the next kind of 20 years, we're talking about needing to go back in and manage these populations a little more directly. And a lot of the people that I've talked to that talk about, the way things were and how people used to live on the land, especially prior to 1952, they talk a lot about trapping. And so it's pretty obvious when you talk about this stuff with elders that they feel that humans are not just someone who lives on the landscape, but a part of it. And so there's a potential role there for, reintroducing, human pressure on these populations to the landscape in a way that benefits some of these other goals, management actions that are probably going to be mandated to be done. So that's one of the things that we're really interested in exploring over time is how could CLFN do that? What else can I tell you? As far as gaining more information, our department will post a bunch of stuff up to the website for people to look at. There's a new website that's going to go live in the next little while here. We could start a page on caribou. As always, you can always contact us through Facebook or phone or email. We're going to try to do some more of these sessions. I think we got some good questions. There's still stuff coming in, so we'll try to get to as many of them as we can here. Yeah.
Do you think if band members go up in the bombing range on the weekends and do some caribou tracking, would that help getting the information?
Yeah, so the question was about caribou tracking in the weapons range during the winter here. So the question was, do you think that would help provide information from the department if we had a better understanding of caribou movement? So the short answer is, I think yes. I mean, one of the things we want to be cautious about is that the caribou will try to avoid places where there's a lot of people tracking down trails, because often skidoos and argos and stuff like that bring in the wolves. It makes the highway for the wolves to access them. So I guess I'm a little bit cautious about that, because if you bring in a bunch of Argos and Skidoos, then you're packing down the axis, you're bringing in more wolves, and you might actually be hurting the caribou. The flip side of that equation is that, yeah, a lot is not known about populations, and I can certainly see how having more people on the ground recording this information would be useful. The other thing that's really useful is actually caribou scat. So I haven't actually sorted out with certainty that you can do this yet, but I'm given to understand that you can learn a lot from caribou scat. You can learn about what they're eating. Depending on the work you do, I think you can also learn about the population through DNA work with information you can get from the scat. And of course the same goes for wolves. I mean, a better understanding of where the wolves are going and what the wolves are eating is an important part of this process. The other thing that I guess we're interested in knowing more about is beavers. So beavers are one of the primary things that wolves eat other than caribou. So if we are, in the long run, going to suppress the population of wolves and beavers, we would really like to know more about where the beavers are on the Clar. So especially on the Clar, things are confined to roads. The question is, how do you get people kind of off the roads, right? And that ties into larger land management planning issues that the department's hopefully working on now. Okay, so someone's suggesting that we send a delegation out to Fort St. James to speak with the community on caribou issues. Yeah. So could we do that? So that is one of the things that we are definitely looking at. I just want to say that like those BC bands already know how to do this, and I guess our plan isn't to reinvent the wheel. I mean, we know that we can go out there and talk to these people. It's just a question of which is the most important thing for our department to do, you know, in the next week or two. And we have a very short timeline to do this. I mean, we're talking about April 1st, which is, what, 68 days from now? And there's only so many people that work at our department, and we have a million other things on the go. There's Imperial, we can't keep their oil in the ground or in the pipes, constantly causing emergencies, and you know there's the expansion program. We have a million other things on the go. I mean, I certainly agree, absolutely. One of the things I would like to do is try to send some people out to work on that penning project during the capture and then the calving. And I've had some just brief, I've exchanged emails with the people that run the lands departments out there at Salto and Westmo, and we're going to see how that develops. I think everybody's into it. Everybody likes this idea. There's nobody who's against it yet that I've talked to. So we really hope that will happen. And yeah, that's I think it's fair to say that, you know, that's a good idea. So do we have anything more here? Okay, so that's about 40 minutes, which is probably longer than most people want to listen to me for. So yeah, feel free to keep posting comments up there. If you're listening to this as a recorded instead of live, feel free to keep posting comments. We'll keep track of the thread, and we will try to respond to comments. And I just hope people understand that we're trying to do as good a job as we can at engagement. If this works, we'll do more of it. You know, we really want to hear from you not only about questions related to caribou and the stuff we're talking about here, but also about how you feel about this method of talking to the community. So I guess we'll take one final question because it's up here. So it's about, is industry helping with information? And so the short answer here is that, yeah, they're going to have to be submitting that to the government. And so right now, the problem is that CLFN doesn't really have a clear role in the caribou recovery. And that is one of the things that, of course, our department is interested in giving, you know, leadership in the community the option in the future if they want it. So I think in the future you'll find that Synovus and other people are actively involved in this stuff, and certainly going to be, you know, engaged with providing information and also, potentially funding and managing some of these, recovery programs. The thing to remember here about especially industry is this is a huge problem for them. If a Section 61 order came down restricting any future development, that would be incredibly bad for them. They are willing to do a lot to try to avoid this. And the government of Alberta is in the same position. Nobody wants a Section 61 protection order. Some people think it's required. Some people think it's inevitable. We'll just have to see what happens. It's a very extreme use of federal legislation. It's been done. It's very clear that the Species at Risk Act has the authority to do this. It's a question of whether the federal minister will. The federal minister, in theory, is required to do this. It's not an option. She's required to do this. It's all about what that range plan says. Right now, the range plan is just tools. It's like being given some toolboxes and some materials and a couple of sketchy plans and having to build a house between now and April. And the tools are only as good as the people using them, and they're only as good as the plans and the blueprints that you're trying to build to. A lot of that stuff really has not been determined. It is really unclear right now what those things will look like. I mean, the government of Alberta has a really big task ahead of them, and CLFN, both the members, the leadership, our department, have to spend a lot of time thinking about, what to do here. There's no clear, good, obvious way to go. Every way to go here has challenges, and as some people have mentioned, learning from what is going on in BC, that's one way that we can really speed the process along. Looking at what the science and the Caribou management people are telling the academic community, that's another really important thing. I mean, even though this has never been done here, a lot is known and understood about how to recover populations. It really just becomes a question of how you apply these things. That's the ultimate question, is how will this be applied in CLFN territory and in the Cold Lake herd range? That's the million-dollar question. Nobody knows the answer to it. We're all waiting around, and I mean, I could design some stuff tomorrow that would help, but ultimately it's long-term planning from industry, it's long-term planning from government, it's habitat analysis and modeling work looking at where are the most effective places to reclaim when you have a limited budget. That is really important, and there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of uncertainty about how this stuff will go down, and I just don't have a clear answer for anybody out there. All I can tell you is that, the department's paying attention. We want to make sure the members are as informed as possible, and we'll do whatever we can to get the information out there. So, I don't think we have any more questions up here, so I'm going to sign off. I'm sure people are sick of listening to me, so just keep posting questions up. We'll do our best to get the information out, and thanks for everybody's time this afternoon. Masi.